Hello, and welcome to another edition of Mr. D reading the Hope Chest. Today I'll be reading pages 154 through 161. In the background is what Nashville might have looked like around the 1920s. This is a copy of a postcard, so someone painted this, and then you could mail it to your friends and family if you visited Nashville. So you can see that it looks kind of ritzy. It's got nice tall buildings, and it looks like a classy place. You've got the people on the left are all wearing dresses and nice clothes. What I want you to notice today, though, something to pay attention to, is that Mr. Martin and Myrtle are trying to find a place for Myrtle to stay. And I want you to be listening to see if the places that they're going to visit and where she ends up staying, whether it looks like the kind of place that you see in the postcard here or whether it doesn't. And I want you to think about why or why not that might be the case. So there's a little reading goal, a little scavenger hunt for you to pay attention to while I'm reading. Chapter 13, Dead Horse Alley. Mr. Martin was wrong. There was not one hotel in Nashville that would take in a white man and a colored child. Myrtle realized this a lot sooner than Mr. Martin did. She tried to tell him, but he just got more and more irritable and wouldn't listen. They couldn't even find anywhere to eat lunch. At the first drugstore, they went in and sat down at the lunch counter. The boy at the counter didn't even speak to them. He simply called to the druggist in the back to telephone the police. Myrtle didn't have much trouble getting Mr. Martin out of there. At the next place, the boy behind the counter told them that if they went around to the alley door, he could serve them. Or, he added generously, that Mr. Martin could eat at the lunch counter and Myrtle could eat in the alley. Or I could take my business elsewhere, Mr. Martin snapped. Why don't you just take it back up north, said the boy, if you don't want to respect our southern customs. After the fourth drugstore, Myrtle suggested that they eat in the alley because she was getting hungry. So that's what they did, sitting on stone steps behind a drugstore beside an overflowing garbage can, eating egg salad sandwiches and sipping chocolate phosphates. At least prices are cheap in the South, said Mr. Martin, who had paid 20 cents for their lunch. I don't think I like it here, Myrtle repeated. Myrtle's people had lived in Washington ever since the Civil War. Washington wasn't exactly the South, her mother had said, but it wasn't exactly the North either. Mama had sometimes talked about moving up to the north. She would have been happy that Myrtle ended up in New York, but Myrtle didn't care for the Girls' Training Institute, and she knew Mama wouldn't have cared for it either. Mama had meant for Myrtle to get an education and do something in the world, something besides be somebody's maid. Mr. Martin seemed to get the point about the hotels quicker, perhaps because of their experience at the Tulane. Most of the hotels probably didn't have room anyway, Myrtle thought, because the entire city seemed to be full of visitors wearing red or yellow roses. But the hotels with doormen stopped them at the door, and those without, the desk clerks shook their heads and said, They have to take us in at one of these places, Mr. Martin said as they crossed Capitol Hill and came down on the other side to a row of disreputable-looking hotels and rooming houses which seemed to be leaning on each other for support. They went into one that said rooms 25 cents over the door. And I just want you to think about that real quick. So they just paid, their whole lunch was 20 cents. And now they're going to a hotel that's going to cost them 25 cents. So that, let's think about, is this a really nice hotel? It's probably not going to be. That's like, going to McDonald's and then, getting a hotel for like $15. Yeah, it's not going to be a very nice hotel. But when we think about what the author, how the author chooses to write things, that's a very specific thing. The author chose to have lunch be 20 cents and then chose to have this hotel be 25 cents to help the reader, the careful reader, get an idea of the type of establishments that, Myrtle and Mr. Martin are visiting. So pay attention to those small details because they can actually be quite helpful in understanding the text and in making some inferences, that the author doesn't want to take the time to go right out and say. Anyway, back to our scheduled programming. They walked into a gloomy lobby furnished with weak-backed chairs and a grease-stained sofa that looked like it had fought in the Civil War and lost. Men who seemed to be as much a part of the decor as the tobacco-stained carpet were slumped on the furniture, looking as if they'd come in with it. The clerk at the desk sat behind a protective brass cage, in case any of the men in the lobby came to life and attacked, Myrtle supposed. He seemed less affronted than the clerks in the other hotels at the idea that he might have room for Myrtle. Sorry, we don't take colored, he said. We try to run a nice hotel here. Myrtle looked around at the men on the chairs, one of them whom was swigging enthusiastically out of a brown bottle labeled Best Stomach Bitters. A cloud of cigarette smoke hovered between their heads and the ceiling. Cigarette butts were scattered around the men's feet. "To tell the truth, sir," said the desk clerk, "we don't allow ladies here anyway, not even white ones. You can never tell with females, sir, and we do try to keep the place decent." "I can see that," said Mr. Martin. "Tell me, is it too much to hope that there's anywhere we can lodge in this great city of Nashville?" "Well, there's a woman down in Crappy Chute that takes in colored," said the desk clerk, thinking. "No, come to think of it, I guess she was burned out in the 1916 fire. Now, there's a colored YMCA downtown, but of course they won't take the child. Or you either, come to think of it. Now, if you want to send her over to Hex Half Acre—" "I'm not sending a 7-year-old girl to a place called Hex Half Acre," Mr. Martin said. "I'm 10, sir," Myrtle reminded him. "Oh, that's just the name," the desk clerk shrugged. "Smoky Roll's just as bad. Here." He dipped his pen in ink and wrote a name and address on a piece of paper. "This woman on Dead Horse Alley rents to colored people. Just head up the 6th Avenue, and this is 5th Avenue that we're on in the picture. Just head up on 6th Avenue, cross the Louisville and Nashville track, and then ask someone else for directions." Mr. Martin took the paper. "Thanks." The desk clerk leaned forward against the brass bars of his cage. "Listen, young man," he said, dropping his voice so that Myrtle had to strain to hear him. "I know what it looks like to you Northerners. But the way we do things in the South, our special customs. But we have a very harmonious relationship between the races down here. Very harmonious." Mr. Martin opened his mouth to answer this, but Myrtle grabbed his arm and led him quickly out the door. They walked up 6th Avenue away from the Capitol. The street was cobbled with gray brick-shaped stones and had concrete sidewalks and sloped and slouched disconsolately into the street. The 2-story brick buildings lined the street, and with wooden water towers rising above them. "I don't ever want to be anybody's servant," Myrtle said. "I agree," said Mr. Martin. "Don't be. Excuse me, sir." The colored man Mr. Martin called to looked surprised at being called sir. He touched his hat deferentially and gave Mr. Martin directions to the address the desk clerk had written down. Mr. Martin touched his own hat in return. Myrtle thought the two were making each other very uncomfortable. It got worse when they got to Dead Horse Alley. Now, this is where I want you to listen and see if where they're at is like what's on the picture I've got behind here. They had run out of brick houses and stone streets by then. There was a smell of outhouses and rotting food on the hot air, and foul water ran down a gutter at the side of the street. The houses were made of wood, mostly unpainted or painted so long ago that you could no longer tell what color they were supposed to be. "I guess this must be Dead Horse Alley," said Mr. Martin. "According to those directions that fella gave me." He sounded doubtful. Myrtle could see why. It didn't look like an alley. It looked like a dry gully cut by a rushing creek that would be back again the next time it rained. It wasn't even flat. There was no way you could have driven a wagon up it, even if it had been wide enough. A woman was sitting on the stoop of what looked like a cowshed, sewing. "Yes, this is Dead Horse Alley," she said. "Can you tell us where we might find Mrs. Eugenia Reddy, ma'am?" Mr. Martin said. "I'm Mrs. Eugenia Reddy," said the woman. She stood up. She was older than Mama would have been, Myrtle thought, but not really old. She wore an old-fashioned blue dress that came to her ankles and had her hair done up on top of her head, but not straightened. Mama had never straightened her hair either. But this woman was looking at them, both a little suspiciously, and she got more suspicious when Mr. Martin explained that they were looking for lodgings. The problem, it seems, was that Mr. Martin wanted to stay there too. Mrs. Reddy was uncomfortable with that. She seemed to be thinking that if Mr. Martin wanted to stay in a place like Dead Horse Alley, he must be on the run from the law or something. Mr. Martin's evil-looking scar probably encouraged her impression, which, Myrtle had to admit, was correct. She quoted a high price, $2 a week, but Mr. Martin accepted it without demurral, and she seemed to feel she had no choice but to let them inside. The house really had been a cowshed at one point. Myrtle was sure of it. A wooden floor had been put down, and the place was scrupulously clean, but it still smelled faintly of cows. The 2 partitioned-off bedrooms reminded Myrtle of stalls. One of them was clearly Mrs. Reddy's room. The other one she supposed Mr. Martin would get, and she'd have to be in the kitchen. The kitchen had a wood cook stove, a dry sink, and a table covered with checkered oilcloth. The treadle sewing machine stood against the wall. There was a shelf with a Bible on it and a wedding picture of Mrs. Reddy and some fellow who must be Mr. Reddy. Next to it was a picture of a serious-looking young lady with round glasses. Next to that was a yellow rose stuck in a bottle. The girl is my daughter, Rosalie. She's in preparatory classes for Fisk University. She aims to be a doctor. There's a colored medical school, Mihari, in Nashville, said Mrs. Reddy. The gentleman and my husband, Walter, he was killed in the Dutch Bend train derailment of 1918. I'm sorry, ma'am. Mr. Martin looked like he was thinking of saying something Bolshevist about railroads and thought better of it. Myrtle had learned on their travels that he thought railroads were all run by robber barons who didn't care if their workers and passengers died. I'm sorry to hear it, ma'am. Does that yellow rose mean? Yes, I'm a suffragist, said Mrs. Reddy defiantly, and I support the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. So do we, said Myrtle. Well, just stay out of sight, child, said Mrs. Reddy. That's our job this week. She sounded bitter. I can always stay out of sight, ma'am, said Myrtle. I can turn invisible. Child, we can all do that. All right, thank you for listening. So did you notice the difference between where they ended up staying and where they sort of began the chapter at? You know, look at the picture behind us. There's these nice broad streets, very clean and classy. But then the only place that they could find that would take them in, smelled like outhouses and rotting food, and they're staying in an old cowshed, so it's like an old barn. It's a barn that's been converted into somewhat of a house. And so I want you to think about why that might be the case. Thank you for listening today. Bye-bye.